Welcome to Fumaça. Today, we have as a guest Ben Ehrenreich, American journalist and author of The Way to the Spring, Life and Death in Palestine. This interview was recorded in June. So you've been to Nabi Saleh multiple times. Can you talk about the significance of the village in the whole Palestinian resistance?
Yeah, Nabi Saleh is a very tiny village, about 600 people, that has, I think, taken a really outsized symbolic role, particularly for international audiences. And beginning in 2009, the people of Nabi Saleh decided to start weekly protests against the occupation. And the immediate spur for this was that settlers who lived in Halamish, which is the settlement across the valley from Nabi Saleh, which was built entirely on the land of Nabi Saleh and a neighboring village called Denidam, had, after taking, for years, taking more and more agricultural land, had taken a spring at the base of the hill that the settlement is perched on. And the spring was not, it wasn't a lot of water. It wasn't water that people depended on to live. But it was used by farmers, and it was used because springs are rare, and it was a beautiful place that people from the village would go to sit, to picnic, etc. And it was sort of the final straw. So first, spontaneously, young men from the village, I think the first time it was just the young men, and some friends of theirs, university students, went down to protest and were chased away by settlers and by, eventually, of course, by the army, which is never far away if there are settlers around. And they decided to keep doing it, to go back every week. And they decided a couple things which ended up being fairly fateful in terms of their being able to attract a lot of people from abroad, which is they decided to welcome the media, and they decided to welcome anyone who would come, including Israelis, which means that from the start, there's been a significant presence of Israeli solidarity activists at those demos, and they also welcomed international solidarity activists. So for the next couple of years in particular, Nabi Saleh became a sort of pilgrimage spot for young activists from all around the world. If you're going to go to Palestine, there were a number of other villages doing demonstrations like this, but Nabi Saleh was certainly on the map. And it was unique in another way, in that Nabi Saleh was the only one of the villages that practiced these kinds of protests, which is to say, unarmed protests, where people march every week with their hands empty, except for the protest signs they're carrying. And the other thing that made them unique was that the women in the village and the children even also took part in these, which I think is another thing that made Nabi Saleh attractive to international audiences. And go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to take what you were saying about unarmed resistance. Your book, The Way to the Spring, Life and Death in Palestine, reads, "In public, Bassem labored to be polite, but he refused to engage with the question of whether stone throwing counted as violent or not. He didn't bother with the term non-violent. Nabi Saleh's resistance was unarmed. Boys throwing stones were unarmed. Soldiers were. That was the distinction that mattered." Is stone throwing unarmed resistance?
Yeah, I think this is a question that comes up again and again, particularly certainly in American audiences. People say, "What? They're not nonviolent; they're throwing stones." And if you've ever been to one of these demonstrations and you see a unit of soldiers, young Israeli men, wearing helmets, wearing body armor, traveling in heavily armored vehicles that are ready for far more deathly forms of combat, who were carrying, at a minimum, are carrying assault rifles, whether they're American M16s or Galils. The question of whether stone throwing is violence becomes an absolutely absurd one. When you see a bunch of young men and children throwing rocks at these armored vehicles, or see them throwing them at soldiers from, usually they can't get closer than 100 yards or so. The question becomes absolutely absurd. It is extremely difficult to get close enough to hit one of them with a rock, and it very rarely happens. I put in a call to the Israeli military spokesperson's office when I was doing research for the book, and said, has a soldier ever been killed by stone throwing? And it took them a little while to get back to me. And the first they said, well, people have been injured. And I said, no, but has anyone been killed? And eventually they came back and they said no. They had no records of any soldier ever having been killed. And, of course, thousands of Palestinians have been killed by Israeli soldiers. So it's not even a question of an asymmetrical confrontation. To even suggest that there's any kind of equity of terms at all, I think is pretty absurd.
You've also been to a few of those marches. You describe in your book a few of them. Can you describe what happens there, especially what happens when, I think a few years ago, when the marches were had more people than right now in 2018?
Yeah, the first ones that I went to were, fairly large. There was a large contingent of international activists. There was a large contingent of Israeli activists in those days. Like, that's pretty much what Israeli anarchists and Israeli leftists, did on their Fridays, was they went to Nabi Saleh and the other villages. So everyone gets together in the center of the village. There's one tree that everybody stands under, not far from the mosque. And when the noon prayer lets out and the people who are praying come out to join the protest, there's a little bit of speech making, and often there was a theme for the particular march, that relates to something that was happening. And then everyone sets off down the main road through the village to join the highway that passes through the village. And there's a bend that they come to onto that highway. And usually, and they have to turn left around that bend in order to reach another road, which will take them to the spring. And usually a couple hundred yards after they've made that first turn, sometimes less than that, soldiers begin firing tear gas at them in considerable quantities. I don't think I've ever been to a protest there, and I've been to many of them where that didn't happen. Maybe one. And people try to keep marching. Usually they can't get very far. There's a bit of there's usually a little while where people sort of stand their ground on the road. The soldiers then usually shoot more and more tear gas. Usually they also start shooting rubber-coated steel bullets, which can and have been deadly. They throw stun grenades. In recent months particularly, they have also been shooting live ammunition. And usually, eventually, with all of this, people eventually scatter. And when they do, usually the young men from the village start throwing stones at the soldiers to push them out of the village, throwing them with their hands, throwing them with slings. And then in the old days, that would last for many hours. In the summertime when it stays light until late, if the protests began at 1, often until dark, at close to 9 p.m., the young men would be trying to push the soldiers out of the village with nothing but stones. And it would go on for many hours. while that's happening, people are frequently injured because they're hit with the various munitions that the soldiers shoot at them. Sometimes people are arrested. The soldiers will grab people. And on 3 occasions, I should say actually 4 occasions, people have been killed in Nabi Saleh. Only 2 of those, I believe, were on a Friday protest. The first person to die in Nabi Saleh was a young man named Mustafa Tamimi, who was shot in the face with a tear gas canister at close range, fired from out of the back of an Israeli jeep. So the consequences of this can be quite severe.
There's also, the extended Tamimi family in Nabi Saleh have also not only killings, but dozens of them were arrested over the past years. So right now, at least Ahed Tamimi, Nariman Tamimi, and I think Mohammed Tamimi is also arrested. Why does that happen?
Ahed's older brother Wad and Nariman's son Wad is also in prison. Yeah.
Why does that happen?
Well, I think as you alluded to, the demonstrations really lost strength over the years. And in the early years, there were a lot of arrests. They arrested a lot of the young men. They arrested some of the older leaders like Bassem Tamimi and Naji Tamimi and kept them in prison for, I think Bassem's longest stint was 11 months. And they were really doing everything they could to break these protests, because it's an enormous cost on families if they lose someone like that. Not just the emotional cost of having your son or your brother or your daughter or your mother in prison, but the financial cost of an earner, who can't help contribute to the family's expenses. And people pushed on despite that. But I think over the years, it got to be too hard. And less people were showing up for the demonstrations. I think the international attention moved elsewhere. Less and less, fewer and fewer activists were showing up. And they decided eventually, I think it was in 2016 or 17, not to do it weekly anymore. Just to have demonstrations when there was some cause to some event that was occurring that they wanted to, that they couldn't sit down for. Despite this, the Israeli military, I think, as soon as they slowed down, the Israeli military picked up its oppression in the village and started, raiding more and more. Actually, it was in 2015 they had arrested most of the young men in the village, and it was after that the demos really stopped for a while. Most of them were released, and in the last 6 months again, they have arrested, as you mentioned, I think it's about 20 of the young men in the village. And these arrests are not particularly, it's not like come to the police station, surrender yourself. They come in the middle of the night. Or early in the morning. Soldiers, come into people's homes, wake them up, search the homes, turn everything over, and terrify the children. Which means that really since the demonstrations have begun in 2009, people have lived in constant fear of these raids and arrests. Every time you go to sleep in Nabi Saleh, you know that you may not wake up in the same bed you went to sleep in. That your sleep may be very rudely interrupted by armed men.
So that was what happened to Ahed Tamimi in December. In the night of 19th of December, she was arrested. You wrote in your piece, Ahed Tamimi has become the symbol of a new generation of Palestinian resistance, published in The Nation in December last year. Please don't make Ahed a hero. Heroes, when they are Palestinian, end up dead or behind bars. Let her be a kid. Fight to set her free so that one day she can be an ordinary woman in an ordinary land. Ahed Tamimi was sentenced in March to 8 months in jail after taking a plea bargain. Did Israel transform Ahed in a Palestinian hero?
Yeah, without question. I think the sort of stupidity of, and it was just the stupidity of oppression in general, and it's certainly true of Israel as well, is that all their attempts to defeat resistance through brute violence end up only creating more resistance. And the Ahed was arrested because she had defied an Israeli soldier. On the same day that her brother's best friend was shot in the face with a rubber-coated steel bullet, and everyone thought he had been killed. She slapped a soldier who was standing in her yard to try to get him to leave her yard. People in the village videotaped this and put it online. The Israeli media got a hold of it, and Israel, the nation with one of the strongest militaries in the world, was suddenly overtaken with outrage at how they had been humiliated by this child. And the spectacle that followed was really grotesque. It was involved, Israeli politicians and major media figures calling for violence against Ahed.
The Minister of Education, Naftali Bennett, said the women seen assaulting Israeli soldiers in the video should finish their lives in jail.
Yeah, the Minister of Defense also had nasty things to say, as did I believe the Minister of Interior. And what followed was can we say shitstorm on this program? A sufficient shitstorm that they had to be arrested. So they arrested Ahed, and the next day arrested her mother on ridiculous charges. I think while it is absolutely criminal that Ahed has had to spend a good chunk of this last year in prison. And it's been, I talked to her dad a couple weeks ago, and she's studying for her exams in prison. The fact that she's being released on an 8-month sentence is in fact a victory. The conviction rate in the Israeli military courts is 99. I forget what percent, but basically
99.74.
99.74. Thank you. It is. These are absolutely show trials. Designed to legitimate an oppressive system. And
I've interviewed Gabi Lasky, her lawyer, and she told me, well, first of all, we have to understand that the military court is not really a court of justice, since its sole purpose is to perpetrate occupation.
Yeah. It was quite clear that when there was a case here that was suddenly getting all this international attention, the first thing that the court did was close the proceedings to outsiders and to the media, so that what happened behind closed doors would not be seen by the press. So I think on some level, the Israeli government realized that locking Ahed up had backfired. That had only turned her, into a symbol for the entire world, and that the best thing they could do was get rid of the case as quickly as they could. So they had to still pander to people who were demanding that she be punished, but they didn't want to make more of an issue of it than they could, so they gave her 8 months. Which means that all of this means that a kid has suffered like profound injuries because of the machinations of this oppressive regime.
Changing topics a little bit. Since the 13th of March, the beginning of the Great Return March, more than 100 Palestinians were killed by Israeli soldiers. Thousands of people were protesting, marching to the fence that separates Israel from Gaza, which Israel calls border, but for example, Norman Finkelstein calls concentration camp fence, after Baruch Kimmerling named Gaza the largest concentration camp ever to have existed. I've interviewed Ilan Pape, a historian and the author of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and he described what's happening right now as a Palestinian third intifada. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I wish I could, but I don't. I think the word intifada has to be used with a certain amount of not caution, but specificity. And the first and second intifadas were both mass uprisings, and both of them at least started as mass uprisings outside of the power of any particular faction. The second intifada, very quickly descended into factionalism. But I think the post-Oslo situation has meant that a lot, if not nearly all, of the grassroots energy that went into resistance activities in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, now gets channeled through the PA and gets channeled into the international NGO complex. And the result, I think, has been that the kind of autonomous networks that existed in the late 1980s that made the first intifada possible, that allowed people to communicate and plan actions, and even that gave people the sense that on a mass level, that they could take their fate into their own hands without relying on anyone else. I think those have been chipped away at very purposefully by the PA and by the international community. And I don't think what we're seeing right now is, I think what we see are outbreaks because the frustration is so extreme. So in 2015 in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, we started seeing these individual, attacks on Israeli soldiers and security forces. And what happened in Gaza this spring, I think, was also a mass display of profound frustration. But it didn't spread to the West Bank. It didn't spread to Jerusalem. There were small protests, as there always are, but there wasn't the kind of mass uprising that we saw in the first and second intifadas. So I think there's a degree to which observers are constantly waiting for another intifada and wanting to say that one has arrived or one's about to arrive. But I don't think that's what we're witnessing at all. I think we're witnessing a far more complex and difficult situation.
And why do you say the post-Oslo Accords ended that possibility?
Well, because one of the things that Oslo did was it created the Palestinian Authority, which was something that looks like a state, which has there are ministries, there are security forces, there are officials, but it has none of the actual autonomy or sort of functioning institutions of a state. But it does have tons of money coming in from foreign donors, the U.S. among them, and employs a large percentage of the Palestinian population. And what that has meant is that for many Palestinians, as much as they may be frustrated with the corruption of their leaders, as much as they may be frustrated with the many, many ways in which the PA leadership has been co-opted by the occupation and acts in concert with Israeli forces to suppress any resistance, as much as all of this may drive them crazy and they may find it absolutely humiliating and infuriating, at the same time, the PA has become, everyone is dependent on the PA. It's not, might be a tiny exaggeration, but not much of one to say that there's not a family in the West Bank that isn't in some way dependent on PA salaries. This makes things extremely, extremely difficult. On the other side of that has been something, I alluded to, that since Oslo, we've seen the NGOization of Palestinian civil society. In the 1980s, several of the factions, the PFLP, the Communist Party, and Fatah, all put huge amounts of energy into creating grassroots networks that would allow the West Bank to function autonomously without the institutions of the occupation. Medical networks, training nurses so that villages wouldn't be dependent on centralized medical care, educational networks, so that if the Israelis closed the schools, the kids could still learn, communication networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. None of that exists. And I think the PA has partly been responsible for this as it tries to centralize its own power. But I think international NGOs also bear a huge amount of responsibility.
Are those NGOs and the whole NGO network in Palestine what the ex-president and ex-prime minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, would call neocolonialism?
Yeah, I don't think that's off at all. I think it's as every bit as complex as neocolonial relations are. But yeah, you have most of the NGOs are answerable to their donors, to their funders, and the largest funders for most NGOs come from the US, the UK, and the EU. On some level, sometimes explicit, sometimes not, the NGOs know that they can't stray too far from the political imperatives imposed by their donors, which means that they cannot support projects that challenge the status quo in any fundamental way. And not challenging the status quo in any fundamental way means not challenging the occupation in any fundamental way. Which means that, not only is there this large and well-funded infrastructure in place, which may challenge individual acts, which may come out and say, no, please don't destroy those solar panels, which we just installed last week, or, please don't move this particular group of Bedouins. We're really upset if you do that. Like it may on individual levels work and help individual families, villages, etc., but it's not going to make any of the kind of structural analyses and structural challenges that might actually change the situation. But it also means that it sucks up huge amounts of absolutely vital energy. That for young people growing up in the West Bank, the NGOs are a way to do good, first of all, which is hard to do, right? If you do want to protect a village which is suffering demolitions and whatnot, you can work for an NGO. But it's also a way to secure a salary in a highly precarious situation. It's also a way to possibly get out and study abroad. And all of this means that people who in the past might have thrown their energies into grassroots resistance efforts are instead trying to get jobs with NGOs or trying to write grant proposals for NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. So all this energy that might actually be challenging the occupation instead is being redirected towards organizations who will do anything but really challenge the occupation.
I've interviewed Jamal Juma in Ramallah last year, the coordinator of Stop the Wall. And he told me all they're using the Palestinian Authority for is as collaborators. They're just like working for the security of Israel and protecting the Israelis and against the Palestinian society if they want to make any revolutions or intifadas or organize themselves in any movement. So we're facing this police systems. It has become a police authority like an authoritarian regime. And how has been hitting the freedoms, chasing journalists. It's been so bad. So I think the PA in this performance is against the Palestinian dream, the Palestinian lives, the Palestinian self-determination, the Palestinian willing. Do you think today the Palestinian Authority perpetuate the occupation? Are they against a free Palestine?
Yeah, I think without question. I think, just in the last few weeks, there were major demonstrations against the PA in Ramallah, which were repressed brutally. And when the PA represses demonstrations, they use the same tactics as the Israelis do. They use tear gas, they use their clubs, they use the tactics that they've learned from the Israelis. Sometimes they use the same munitions. I remember having been in the aftermath of protests that were repressed by the PA, where people pick up the tear gas canisters, and they're Israeli tear gas canisters. They bought them from the Israelis. I think we've seen it's often extremely direct. Where I've been at protests in Ramallah, where young people are trying to march towards Beit Il. Beit Il is a settlement and military base just outside of Ramallah. And it's one of the frequent flashpoints because it's one of the closest ones that you can walk to. And so the young people have been trying to march towards this military base to challenge the occupation forces, and the PA gets in their way. And they end up being beaten and arrested and scattered by the PA forces. So there's this very direct way in which the PA acts as the advanced forces of the occupation in terms of directing of repressing any real resistance. It's not metaphorical. It's not that complex. It's fairly easy to witness. That whenever anyone wants to make any kind of real challenge to the occupation forces, the PA is usually the first ones to be there to make sure that doesn't happen.
Coming now to an end, Donald Trump, President of the United States, inaugurated this year the new American embassy in Jerusalem, sparking international condemnation. How different is Trump from other American presidents on this issue?
Trump, as he has been for a man who's every time he opens his mouth, a lie comes out. The thing that's, I think, most interesting about him is his inability to keep up the lies that have sustained American foreign policy and American domestic policy, and to instead, whether he means to or not, speak the brutal and racist truth that have been behind the lies America has been telling itself and telling the world for so many years. For decades now, the U.S. has imagined itself this impartial broker that was going to bring peace to the Middle East by, mediating negotiations between Israel and the PA. There are a lot of problems with this notion. First of all, that the PA is, as we've been talking about, already completely compromised and already very much an agent of Israel in many of its acts. But on top of that, the balance has been, the U.S. has always favored Israel in all of these negotiations, and it's been anything but a fair broker, and has always been trying to, press the PA to take less, press the Palestinian representation to accept less and to accept a settlement that would be completely unsatisfactory to most Palestinians.
But the changing the American embassy to Jerusalem is something that previous presidents always said, right? George W. Bush in the year 2000, in his speech before the APAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, said, "Something will happen when I'm president. As soon as I take office, I will begin the process of moving the U.S. ambassador to the city of Israel as chosen to it as its capital." Barack Obama in 2008, also at the APAC, "Let me be clear, Israel's security is sacrosanct. It is non-negotiable. The Palestinians need a state that is contiguous and cohesive and that allows them to prosper, but any agreement with the Palestinian people must preserve Israel's identity as a Jewish state with secure, recognized, and defensible borders. Jerusalem will remain the capital of Israel, and it must remain undivided."
Yeah, I think while they're running for president, they make these promises to the evangelical right in the U.S., and then they don't follow through with them. It's been American law for some time that the embassy should be moved to Jerusalem, and past presidents have issued waivers every time it comes up again because no one wants to actually do it because it's stupid. And because it gives up the game that America has sort of very carefully been playing and played very carefully under Obama and under Bush and under Clinton, that the U.S. was this mediator, that we were all going to come to a nice two-state solution, and everything was going to be fine, and we could kind of keep kicking the ball into the future. That game's over now, and I think that as soon as Trump did that, as soon as he followed through on his campaign promises, which were mainly promises he made to Sheldon Adelson, who was one of his largest backers and a fiercely right-wing supporter of Israel and player in Israeli politics. As soon as he did that, the charade that the U.S. had been playing and cultivating for so many years fell apart completely. So that even figures that had been willing to play along, despite all the humiliations over these years, such as Mahmoud Abbas, could no longer play. And it was clear to everybody that the two-state solution had been dead for a very long time. Maybe not everybody, but to a growing number of us. But despite this, it was all anybody talked about. Now it's clearly absurd. Trump.
But you can also argue that the charade was also pretty transparent. For example, the Obama administrator signed a bill in 2016 for a military aid program for the decade, giving $38 billion to Israel, the largest military aid to be given to any country. So that was very transparent, right? The backing of Israel was always transparent.
It was. I mean, to you it was transparent. To me, it was transparent. While these things were happening, we made these points. But to the New York Times editorial board, to most Washington political insiders, it wasn't transparent. It was still. They had their lines and they were sticking with it. And I think some part of the large part of the American political establishment actually believed it, and that's no longer the case. The charade won't work. The people who've been saying, "Oh, maybe the two-state solution really is over," for the last 10 years, I think finally have to realize that it's not going to happen the way they said it was going to happen.
And is a one-state solution a possibility?
Oh. I think everything's a possibility. The question, I think, is I think we have a one-state reality. And we have had a one-state reality for some time. It's an apartheid state, and it's a viciously and murderously racist state. But we do have a single state. Regardless of the existence of the PA, it is Israel who makes the final decisions that most affect Palestinians' lives. Mahmoud Abbas cannot leave Ramallah without the permission, or cannot leave the West Bank without the permission of the Israelis. So one state reality already exists. The question is what kind of one state that will be in the future, and whether it can be one that with some basis in equality and in the dignity of all people, or if it continues to be a one based in apartheid and a mandate for ethnic cleansing. And that's something I think that will be decided on the ground.
Well, thank you so much, Ben.
You're very welcome.
Fumaça is produced by Bernardo Afonso, Frederico Raposo, Maria Almeida, Pedro Miguel Santos, Pedro Zuzarte, Sofia Rocha, Tomás Pereira, Tomás Pinho, and by me, Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Visit fumaca.pt for new episodes and subscribe to our newsletter and wherever you get your podcasts. Até já!